Sorry for the delay. So I've been asked to talk about testing cattle for infection with the organism Microbiology bovis that causes bovine TB. And for reasons I hope you'll see, because of the different way that tests get applied, actually I'm going to talk about testing cattle in England for M. bovis infection. So the things I'm going to try and talk to you about, and this will be very basic for some of you, are what do the tests do, how and where are they used, because they're used differently in different situations, and then how good are the tests in different situations, and then thinking about what different tests do we need to try and improve the situation. So the current tests that we've got, very broadly, either test for the organism itself, or they test cattle to see if they've mounted a specific immune response to M. bovis that causes bovine TB. So the challenge generally, although there's going to be one talk that looks at a different way of doing this later on today, the challenge at testing for the organism M. bovis in cattle is that where the bug is mostly is in the lungs, or the glands, the lymph nodes around the lungs, the respiratory tract, and you have to kill the cows in order to get samples from them effectively. So tests for the bug itself tend to be restricted to slaughterhouse surveillance, either routinely, where every animal gets tested by meat inspection, or because animals have come up positive on one of the other tests, and then investigations are being pursued to see if the bug is findable in the cows. And then there are either blood tests or skin tests, which can be used to test whether or not cows have, the immune response of cows have met M. bovis. They are used differently in different parts of England. This is a complication in terms of explaining how the tests are used and how they work, but it's a very logical way that the tests are used to improve their utility. So you can see on this map of England, which Wales and Scotland have been purposefully left out for. It's not really less important, it's just this is a map of England. There is a solid red area, which is the high-risk area where the incidence of bovine TB is the highest. And then there is the yellow area, which it's hoped will become bovine TB free, at least officially, in the foreseeable future, which is a low-risk area. And the hatched area in the middle is the edge area, which is an edge between the two, which is of intermediate risk. And although in some parts, such as in Cheshire, the risk is really quite high there. The incidence is relatively high there compared to elsewhere. So how are the tests normally used? And this is a simple, it took me 2 years to understand how tests are used. I'm going to try and describe to you in 1 minute how these cattle tests are used. It's really complicated. So there are routine tests. There are tests used after infection is detected on a herd, and that herd is put under movement restrictions, the only way that animals generally should move from that herd are to go to slaughter. And then there's pre- and post-movement testing, particularly from herds in high-risk areas. The routine tests, so that the surveillance of all animals going through the abattoir by meat inspection. Have they got the lesions of TB in their lungs? There's annual testing of pretty much all animals in herds in high-risk and edge areas. And there's 4-yearly testing of just breeding animals in low-risk areas. So that's the way that tests in the live animal get applied, either annually in the high-risk area or on a 4-yearly basis in breeding animals in the low-risk area. Now, if you find detection in a herd, either on the back of any, in a test that's used for any reason, then the herd is put under movement restriction, and then all animals are tested on a 2-monthly basis, using a slightly different interpretation of the skin test to make it more sensitive, to make it more likely to detect infection if it's there in cattle. And that herd is kept under restriction until 1 or 2 tests sequentially are all negative. Sometimes a more sensitive, newer blood test is used once at the beginning as well. And you'll note that there is culling of all positive cattle that come up positive, which then go to slaughter and get inspected for lesions. In addition to this, if farmers want to move their cattle, particularly from high-risk farms, then they have to undertake pre-movement testing. And increasingly, we're looking to have post-movement testing in low-risk areas for animals that are moved from high-risk areas, for logical reasons. Well, the reasons will become more logical when I start talking about how good these tests are. So it's very difficult to talk about how tests are without going into statistical measures of this, or at least proportional measures of this, because no test for bovine TB is perfect. In fact, no test for any disease is perfect, but the ones for bovine TB are quite imperfect, but quite good as well in some respects. So I'm going to talk about the specificity, the sensitivity, and the predictive values, which sound pretty horrible. I hope I'm going to try and I'll explain them to you adequately if these are terms that you're not familiar with. The specificity of the skin test, as it's routinely used, is 99.98%. Now that sounds pretty high by any measure. What that means is that if you test 5,000 uninfected cows, you will only get one false positive reaction. So you've got to test an awful lot of positive cattle under the standard reading in order to get false positives with the skin test. That sounds reasonably good. In fact, it is a very strong positive characteristic of the skin test. However, its sensitivity is not so good. If you look at its sensitivity compared to the detection at slaughter of cattle with lesions, it's about 80%, with confidence around that. However, finding lesions in cows at slaughter is insensitive. You miss an awful lot of them. And so it's then very difficult to come up with a precise and correct measure of what the true sensitivity of the skin test in detecting infected cattle is. The lowest estimate, which my colleague Andrew Conlon and I and other collaborators came up with, was that it could be as low as around a third, 36%, with a broad confidence limit. Now, this is based on modelling assumptions, which may be wrong. But the point is, when you start looking at how good this test is in detecting all animals at every stage of infection, it's not as good as the 80% measure, which is derived from comparing it to detecting animals with advanced enough disease to have lesions in their lungs. So then what the farmer really wants to know is what a positive test means. How likely is that positive test in his or her farm, how likely is it to be correct? And this is where we use the term the positive predictive value. And this varies for the same test depending on how common the infection is. I can explain that, but it'll take a while, so I'm going to just ask you to accept that. If you look at the likelihood of a positive test in a breakdown, i.e. during, after infection has been detected on the farm, it's got a 96% chance of being right. So it's very likely to be right. If you look at the same value in a routine test, in a whole herd test in a high-risk area, it's 90%. So nearly all of them are right. But in a low-risk area, it's down around 2/3. So a third of them will actually be false positive. But where we're very keen to try and find the infection in a low-risk area, I think at the control level, even if not for that individual farmer, that's a price worth paying. Now there is a new blood-based assay, the gamma interferon assay, or the Bovigam assay, which has a higher sensitivity than the skin test, but it's not precisely quantified against true infection status. It does, however, have a lower specificity. It's published at 96%, but it's probably much better than that, which makes it useful for using during after infection is detected to try and clear out early infected animals, because it's particularly better at finding early infection compared to the skin test. But it's not suitable for routine use because of the fact that its specificity is high enough. It has too many false positives. When we find lesions in cows in the slaughterhouse and you grow the bug from them, they've got the disease. There's 100% specificity there. However, when you've got a meat line and you've just got someone cutting lungs to try and find lesions of bovine TB in them. If they're very sparse, they will miss them, and so the sensitivity is probably quite low for that, but it's a very important test. So the other thing that changes as animals get older is they're much less likely to have lesions when they're skin test positive. So in animals aged 2 years or so, between 50 and 70% of them that are skin test positive will have lesions detectable in routine slaughterhouse surveillance. But in those older animals over 4 years of age, it's somewhere between 20 and 40%, so it's much, much lower. And this gives lie to the vociferously put statement that animals that don't have any lesions detected are just at the early stage of infection. In many cases, it's because they're older and actually more likely to have been exposed earlier in their life for a longer period as a result of that. So how good do the tests really need to be? Well, does it matter if infection gets missed? And of course the answer to that is yes. You miss an infection, you're spreading the infection, you're allowing the infection to spread further either within the herd or from the herd to other species. But there's also qualified no. And I think this is where we've got to think about the control of this disease being not reliant on silver bullets. It would be great if we had a silver bullet, but we don't. And so what we've got to look at is marginal gain with this disease. And what's really important with our testing is that we try to stop transmission occurring on average. We know that because the tests are imperfect, we're going to miss it some of the time. What we've got to do is find it enough of the time so that for every infected herd, less than one gets infected, because that will cause the disease to die out in cattle. And so this brings in the term the effective reproduction number, which is the average number of if we take a herd as the thing we care about, we need every infected herd to cause infection in less than one herd on average, and that will result in the disease coming under control. Now that's a simplified version. In fact, it's rather more complicated than that because of the fact that there are two hosts involved in the high-risk areas in this infection. But the key point in this epidemic theory, which relates to modelling, is that a small difference can actually, if it pushes you through a threshold, have a major impact. So don't be dismissive of a test that is 10% more sensitive, or anything that has an impact of 10% or so. This can help us work towards thresholds. Now, there are a number of other tests under development or available, but not in routine use. There are other blood tests, and there are massive improvements to the skin test that need to be brought in order for us to operate in a way that's sustainable over time. And a critical thing that we don't have at the moment is a validated test in the living animal that can differentiate infection from vaccination. It doesn't matter if it's a skin or a blood test, we need one of those. Because that's the block to vaccination being used. Well, it's one of the major blocks, it's not the only one, of course. So the key challenges are validation. All of the tests that are used have international validation and characteristics which are accepted globally. It's a highly regulated marketplace. And the scale of testing required to get into that is massive, tens of thousands. So that's a barrier. We clearly need more sensitive tests so that we can detect more infection. I think that the real opportunities, I want to end with this point, that the real positive opportunities that suggest that a DIVA, one of these tests that can differentiate infection and vaccination, could in itself be more sensitive than a current skin test. Now, there's a lot of work relating to validation and testing that would need to be to get that anywhere near use, but I think that should be a major area of effort for us to help control this disease. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. Do we have one specific question for James? Yes.
Thank you very much. I wonder whether I could ask James very clearly the falling sensitivity of the skin test at 30, maybe 50% with confidence intervals before.
Under one assumption, under one set of assumptions, it may be better than that.
Okay.
We don't know.
But my specific question is that many of the models that have been used to study the epidemiology of the disease in both species have assumed a sensitivity of 80%, which, as you've explained, is the relative sensitivity. What difference do you think is made to the conclusions from those models of using 80% and not 30 or 50%?
So I can't speak for the specific models, but in general, if you assume your sensitivity is higher than it is, then you're going to think that your cattle controls are going to be more effective than they are. I mean, it's a very straightforward conclusion.
Okay, thank you very much, James. I think we're going to move on. Thank you very much indeed.